What really makes a nation? What's the soul of a people? For about 30 years, the brilliant Brazilian anthropologist Darcy Ribeiro was absolutely haunted by these questions, especially about his own country. What he came up with was his final incredible work, The Brazilian People, basically an epic attempt to diagnose the very soul of his nation. So let's dive right in.
And you've got to understand, this is not just some dry academic book. No way. This book was an act of pure desperation and will. Ribeiro literally escaped from a hospital ICU, convinced that he had to finish this one thing before he died. He grabbed 30 years of notes, went to a beach house, and in just 40 days, he poured out the book he felt he was born to write. It's an incredible story.
And this is the question that drove the whole thing. The central mystery he felt he had to solve. Think about it. After centuries, with all these immense resources and this incredibly vibrant culture, why did Brazil still feel like this unfulfilled promise? Why, as he put it so bluntly, hadn't it worked out? The answer, he was convinced, was right there in its creation.
So to get Brazil, Ribeiro says you first have to understand how Brazilians themselves were forged. And this wasn't some gentle, happy mixing of cultures. Not at all. It was a violent, totally unprecedented collision that created something the world had literally never seen before. He came up with a name for this, the Povo Novo, which means the new people. And that word new is so important here. Ribeiro is adamant that this wasn't just a simple mix, like a melting pot. He saw it as the birth of a completely new national ethnicity, something totally distinct from all of its original parts, indigenous, European, and African.
Okay, so let's break that down a little. This new people has a few key things that define it. First, it's culturally unique. It's not Portuguese, it's not African, it's not indigenous, it's something else entirely. It's also intensely, profoundly mixed. It's powered by what's called a syncretic or blended culture, and a brand new social structure that was basically built on servitude. And yet, and this is the really wild part, through all of that pain and violence, it has what Ribeiro calls an implausible joy and will for happiness.
But, okay, how did this forging even happen? Well, it all started with the meeting of two completely incompatible ways of seeing the world. And the collision, it wasn't just physical, it was metaphysical.
And this slide just illustrates that divide so perfectly. On one hand, you have the indigenous peoples who saw life as a gift. The world was a place of sensory joy, of abundance that you were supposed to share. Your body was for dancing, for fighting, for loving. And then the Europeans arrive, and for them the world is an object of enterprise. Life is about anxious work, driven by this constant need to accumulate, to conquer, and to keep. It's just a fundamental clash of purpose.
So what happens when these two worlds collide? There's no compromise. Ribeiro uses a single powerful word to describe what happened to the indigenous peoples: a hecatomb, a massive, devastating slaughter.
And this was more than just physical death from disease or violence. It was a spiritual death. Faced with the complete and utter destruction of their world, their values, everything they knew, many just gave up the will to live. As Ribeiro writes, they literally died of sadness because any future they could imagine was just a horrible negation of their entire past, a life not worth living.
Now, this didn't just happen overnight. It was a systematic process of subjugation. It starts with enslavement for pure economic gain. Then the missionaries arrive, and they start preaching that all this suffering is actually their own fault, a punishment for their sins. The Portuguese crown then makes this official by declaring so-called just wars. And over time, the very things the indigenous peoples valued most, bravery, solidarity, community, were twisted and reframed as something evil.
And here's the crucial point Ribeiro makes. This history is not in the distant past. These foundational wounds are still wide open, and they are shaping the very structure of modern Brazil and the psyche of its people right now.
This might be the most profound and challenging sentence in the entire book. What Ribeiro is saying here is that every single Brazilian carries this duality inside them. They are the descendants of both the enslaved and the enslaver, of the tortured and the torturer. This deep contradiction, this mix of tenderness and cruelty, that, he says, is at the absolute core of the national identity.
And this psychological inheritance, well, it's not just some abstract idea. It became the actual blueprint for Brazilian society, a society built from the ground up on a foundation of brutal, inescapable inequality.
And you can see the lasting legacies of that structure today. You've got a ruling class that, since day one, has seen the nation as just a resource to be exploited. You get this kind of split personality, especially among the elite, where they can be incredibly warm to their equals but totally callous to their inferiors. You have a deep-seated racism that gets kind of masked by all the mixing, which Ribeiro argues actually weakens solidarity among the oppressed. And you have this social and economic structure that just keeps the nation dependent and unequal.
Visually, this is what that society looks like. You have a tiny, powerful elite at the very top, a really thin middle layer, and then this enormous base of the population living in poverty or just barely getting by. This structure is not an accident. It is the direct functioning result of that original colonial design.
Okay, so this diagnosis sounds pretty grim, I know. But for Ribeiro, Brazil is not a lost cause. It's something else. It's simply an unfinished project, a nation that's still grappling with its own violent birth.
So the great tragedy here isn't what Brazil became. No, it's the constant, haunting feeling of what it could be. A nation that feels like it was born to be something joyful and creative and humane, but it's just forever being held back by the problems that were installed right at its creation. And this brings us to the central conflict that keeps the whole project unfinished. It's the battle between order and progress. You know, the two words written right on the Brazilian flag. But for Ribeiro, order is just code for maintaining the status quo that benefits the elite. Progress, on the other hand, is that deep desire of the people for a more just society, for what he calls a decent Brazil for everybody. And that fundamental conflict has never really been resolved.
So Darcy Ribeiro literally fled death to give his country this diagnosis, a really stark, honest look in the mirror. He identifies the wounds, the contradictions, the conflicts that are still playing out. But he leaves the final and really the most important question to the reader, to the Brazilian people themselves. If this is the disease, then what is the cure?